The storm didn't start with thunder. It started with silence. A kind of silence that presses on your chest before the first raindrop falls, a silence that tastes like memory. It hummed thick over the Wyoming prairie, clinging to the cracked fences and rusted gates of a ranch too forgotten to be mapped. At the edge of that silence, a man sat alone in the saddle of a black horse. His name was Caleb Monroe. 58 years old. A face carved by wind and time. A man of the land, not because he chose it, but because everything else had left. He hadn't spoken to another human being in over 6 weeks. Unless you count the man at the feed store, and even then, only a nod and a muttered thanks. But silence was nothing new for Caleb. It had become part of his bones. What wasn't silent, not ever, was the sound of hooves on wet earth. The rhythm of breath between him and the animal beneath him. Shadowdust. The old horse moved slow now, stiff in the knees, cautious in the mud, but there was something majestic still in the way he held his head. Like he remembered what it meant to run. And Caleb? Caleb remembered, too. He remembered what it meant to ride not for escape, but for presence. For connection. For those long rides across open land with his father, John Monroe, before the man got sick, before he stopped speaking, before he died with his secret sealed tight. Shadowdust was all that was left of that time. A living piece of a man Caleb still tried to understand. Caleb didn't always live alone. Once, he had a wife. A woman with soft eyes and a sharper tongue. But she'd had enough of the winters, the droughts, the way Caleb buried himself in chores instead of conversation. She left without taking anything but a suitcase and the dog. The dog died 6 years ago. The horse stayed. Shadowdust wasn't just a pet. He was the last promise Caleb ever kept. A colt raised on this very land, broken in by Caleb's father, passed down like a right. His coat had faded from jet black to ash around the muzzle, and the white stripe down his face had thinned like a scar, but his eyes still held fire. Some mornings, Caleb would find him waiting by the fence line, staring out toward nothing. Other days, he'd be pacing, agitated, like he knew something Caleb didn't. That morning had been still. Too still. The sky was the color of tin. The smell of ozone clung to the breeze. Caleb should have known better. Should have stayed inside. But he saddled up anyway. Maybe because the silence in the house had become too loud. Maybe because the ache in his chest needed the rhythm of hooves again. He didn't plan to go far. They rode out past the barn, past the old grain silo with the bullet holes, past the gate that always hung half open because Caleb never got around to fixing it. The ground squished under Shadowdust's hooves, wet from the thaw, but not yet dangerous. Caleb steered toward a shallow dip in the earth near the north field. Locals used to call it the belly, a wide, low spot that collected water every spring. Caleb hadn't ridden there in years. Not since the year the creek flooded and nearly washed out the fence. But today, he wasn't thinking about history. He was thinking about movement. About memories. About the way Shadowdust seemed to stretch his legs with every stride, like he, too, was trying to remember something worth holding on to. And then the earth gave way. There was no warning. No crack, no shift, no clue. One moment they were moving forward. The next. A violent, sucking sound. A lurch. Shadowdust's front legs vanished into the ground. Whoa! Whoa, easy, Shadow. But it was too late. The horse bucked wildly, his rear legs flailing in the air, his body pitching forward as the mud pulled him down. Caleb threw himself backward, off the saddle, and hit the ground hard. A bolt of pain shot through his hip as he rolled, boots slipping in the muck. He looked up in time to see the horror unfold, Shadowdust's chest buried, neck straining, eyes wide with panic. The kind of panic animals only get when they know it's not a wound, it's a grave. Hold on, boy. Just hold on. Caleb scrambled to his feet, slipping again. The mud was thick, black, viscous, like well-soaked clay. Every step toward the horse sucked at his boots, dragged him down. But he kept moving. He didn't stop to think. There wasn't time. He grabbed the reins, which were now slick with grime, and tried to loop a rope around Shadowdust's torso. The horse thrashed, eyes rolling white, mouth frothing. "Don't you quit on me!" Caleb shouted. His voice cracked, not from fear, but from something deeper. Something like grief. Grief that had been waiting for this moment to crawl out of the shadows. Memories surged. He was 8 years old again, standing beside his father in this same field. Watching as John Monroe knelt beside a downed calf, whispering to it, calming it, lifting its head from the cold mud. Animals don't fear death, his father had said. They fear being alone when it comes. Caleb never forgot those words. And now, here he was, ankle deep in the same damn mud, holding the head of the one creature left who had never left him. "I'm here," Caleb whispered, crouching beside Shadowdust's neck. "You're not alone, you hear me?" The rain started. Not gentle. Not gradual. It came like a slap. Hard. Cold. Sheets of it. Blurring the horizon. Flattening the grass. Soaking them both to the bone in seconds. Shadowdust trembled, nostrils flaring. His strength was fading. Every breath was a battle. Caleb gritted his teeth. Pulled tighter on the rope. "I've got you," he hissed. But the mud wasn't done. It surged around Caleb's thighs now, sucking him closer. His arms shook. His boots refused to lift. His breath came in gasps. He couldn't save the horse. Not like this. Unless. He unlatched the last loop of rope from his saddle, tied it around Shadowdust's chest just behind the forelegs. The horse whimpered, but didn't fight. Maybe he understood. Maybe he trusted. Caleb wrapped the other end around his own waist. He pulled. Hard. Once. Twice. The mud held. A third time, Caleb screamed, a guttural sound that didn't belong to language. The rope strained. Then slipped. Caleb fell backward, the world spinning. His vision dimmed for a moment. He tasted blood, somewhere in his mouth, a tooth had cut his lip. Shadowdust moaned. And something inside Caleb snapped, not in pain, but in resolve. "I will not bury you," he growled. "Not today." The rain felt like it had a grudge. By the time Caleb found the strength to lift his head, the storm was no longer just a backdrop, it had become a character in the story. An angry one. Water hammered the earth, slapping puddles into craters, turning the field into a battlefield of thunder and mud. The wind screamed through the trees like a warning. And Shadowdust wasn't moving. His head lay half sunken, ears flat, breath coming in slow, wheezing gasps. Caleb's own legs were buried to the knee, trembling with exhaustion and cold. His vision swam, lips blue, every muscle screaming surrender. But he refused to let go of the rope. "Shadow," he murmured, voice cracking. "Don't give up. Not now. Not after everything." The horse's eye fluttered open, barely. And that's when Caleb heard it. Not thunder. Not wind. Footsteps. Human. squishing through the mud with a rhythm too steady for a stranger to the storm. He turned his head sharply, and through the downpour, a figure emerged. Long coat soaked to the bone, wide-brimmed hat dripping, boots sinking with every step, but he moved fast. Purposefully. "Hey!" Caleb shouted, his voice hoarse. "You! I need help," he stuck. The man didn't hesitate. He knelt immediately at the edge of the sinkhole, scanning the situation with a precision that wasn't just casual concern. Horse caught deep. Wet clay, too dense. "You'll both drown if you stay like this," the man said calmly, like he was reading from a field manual. Caleb stared. "You a rancher?" "Nope." "Vet?" "Used to be." "Army?" He didn't offer a name. Didn't need to. Within seconds, the man unhooked a heavy coil of chain from his shoulder. Caleb hadn't even noticed he was carrying it. "Loop this under his belly," the man ordered, tossing one end to Caleb. "Not too tight. Stay away from the ribs. We'll need leverage to get him up." Caleb obeyed, numb with shock but driven by something primal. This man knew what he was doing. "You got a tractor?" the man asked, voice rising above the wind. Caleb coughed, nodded toward the rise. "South side of the barn. 100 yards. I'll get it. Don't let him go." And just like that, the stranger turned and sprinted through the storm. Left alone again, Caleb cradled Shadowdust's head in his lap, whispering, "You're gonna be all right, you hear me? You're the toughest old bastard I know. You pulled me through worse." Shadowdust groaned softly, his ear flicking once, just barely. Caleb brushed mud away from the horse's face, his own breath fogging in the cold air. The wind shifted direction, bringing with it the metallic tang of ozone. Lightning cracked overhead, so close it lit the world white for a second. Caleb didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. The sound came like salvation. Engine. Big. Diesel. The lights cut through the storm as the tractor crested the hill, old, battered, but roaring with life. The man guided it skillfully through the mire, tires spinning but never stuck. Caleb waved, relief washing through his limbs like morphine. The man parked the tractor a safe distance from the sinkhole, jumped down, and moved fast. "Let's get him out before the ground gives more." They worked in rhythm, Caleb with the rope, the man with the chain and hitch. Every movement was calculated, practiced. No wasted effort. "Name's Jonah," the man said at last, tightening a link. "Figured you'd want to know before I yank your horse out of the earth." "Caleb," he managed to grunt. "That's Shadowdust." Jonah nodded once. "Good name." Caleb looked up sharply. "How would you know?" But Jonah didn't answer. "Not yet." On 3, Jonah called from the cab of the tractor. 1. 2. Wait. Caleb knelt beside Shadowdust, pressed his face to the horse's neck. "You're gonna feel pressure. But I'm here. I'm not letting go." Shadowdust snorted, weakly. Caleb stepped back and gave the signal. The tractor growled. Chains groaned. The earth fought. Then, with a horrible squelch, Shadowdust rose. Not all at once. First one leg. Then the second. Then the belly. Then he collapsed sideways onto firmer ground, gasping, twitching. But free. Caleb fell beside him in the mud, both man and beast too tired to cheer. Jonah killed the engine, leapt down, knelt to check the horse's vitals. "Still breathing," he said. "That's a miracle." "No," Caleb muttered. "That's Shadow." Back in the barn, they laid Shadowdust on thick bedding, wrapped in dry blankets, space heater humming. Jonah set about checking his legs, ribs, vitals. Caleb brought warm mash and water. "You've done this before," Caleb said, eyeing Jonah as he moved with confidence. Jonah nodded. "Afghanistan. We had to pull a Mustang out of a ravine once. Broke 3 ribs, but she lived." He didn't say more. Just worked. The storm outside had calmed, but a different kind of tension filled the barn. Caleb sat on a hay bale, watching Jonah as he cleaned a wound on the horse's leg. "You from around here?" Caleb asked. "No," Jonah said, without looking up. "But I've been looking for this place." Caleb frowned. "Why?" Jonah paused. Then he pulled something from the inside pocket of his coat, a cloth bundle. "I think this belongs to you." Inside were old letters. Folded, yellowed with age. One had a name written in handwriting Caleb hadn't seen in decades. John Monroe. Caleb's father. With shaking hands, Caleb opened the first one. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. "If you're reading this, then Jonah found you. He's your brother." Caleb froze. "What is this?" he asked, voice sharp. Jonah sat across from him, meeting his gaze without flinching. "My mother never talked about him," he said. "But after she died, I found these. Letters. Photos. A piece of the past no one wanted me to know. Until I read his handwriting." Caleb stood, pacing. "My father never said a damn word about you. About anyone." "I know," Jonah replied. "He was afraid. You knew his name. You knew the horse." "I met him once," Jonah said softly. "When I was 16. He told me your name. Said I'd have a brother. Asked me not to knock on the door. And you listened?" "I waited. Until today." They sat in that barn a long time. Didn't argue. Didn't cry. Just sat. Shadowdust slept beside them, twitching now and then, his breath steady. At last, Caleb whispered, "Why now?" Jonah shrugged. "Because it was time." And for the first time in years, Caleb didn't feel entirely alone. The sky over Wyoming that morning was a shade of gray you couldn't quite name. The rain had passed, but the wind still slipped through the slats of the old barn, whispering like voices from a past no one had dared to speak aloud. Caleb sat still, his gaze fixed on the letters spread across the brittle hay. The paper had yellowed with time, its edges worn and creased, but the handwriting was as clear as ever. He knew it well. He had seen those letters on report cards, on Christmas tags, and scratched into the inside cover of old farm journals. His father's handwriting. Across from him sat Jonah, silent. Not pushing. Not pleading. Just sitting with the quiet patience of someone who had waited a lifetime for a single truth to be spoken. Caleb reached for the second letter. His hand trembled. "Caleb, if someday you learn about Jonah, please understand, I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I'd already hurt too many people. And I didn't have the courage to face both worlds I had built." Caleb gripped the letter tightly. A wave of emotion surged in his chest, not quite anger, not quite grief. It was emptiness. The kind of emptiness that felt like someone had opened the floor of your childhood and exposed a darkness you never even knew was there. "Am I the brother? Or just the one who got lied to?" he muttered, his voice thick, as if each word had to claw its way out. "He knew," Caleb rasped. "He knew I lived here. Knew my mother. Knew I believed he was a decent man, a man with one life, one family. Jonah nodded solemnly. He told me I was his greatest regret. Caleb stood up sharply, pacing the barn like a caged animal. So what now? You show up in a rainstorm, hand me letters, say you're my brother, and expect what? What exactly? That I just open my arms and say, "Welcome home"? Jonah didn't flinch. He remained seated, voice calm. I'm not expecting anything. I didn't come to ruin your life. I came to find out who I am. Caleb reached for the canvas pouch, digging deeper into the pile of letters. There it was, a photo. Fort Hood, 1973. A young man in military uniform cradled a newborn. Caleb recognized the man instantly. His father. And the baby in the picture, there was no mistaking it. Jonah. Caleb dropped into the nearest hay bale like the weight of the truth had knocked the air out of him. I never saw him like that. Not once. Jonah's voice came out in a whisper. And I never got to remember him at all. The wind outside had quieted, but inside the barn, a different kind of storm had begun to swell. Caleb stared at the photograph again, fingers tightening around its worn edges. His jaw clenched. I can't wrap my head around this, he muttered. The man who taught me how to tie a knot, fix a fence, break a horse, he kept an entire son hidden from me? Jonah stayed silent, giving Caleb space to unravel. You know what hurts? Caleb turned, voice rising. It's not that he had another child. It's that he trusted a stranger with the truth more than he trusted me. I wasn't looking for trust, Jonah replied quietly. Just the truth. Caleb scoffed. And you think dumping it all on me in one night was the best way to do it? I waited years, Caleb. I waited for my mother to pass, for the right time. There is no perfect way to break something like this. You still should have stayed gone. The words hung in the air like smoke. Jonah didn't flinch. If that's how you feel, I understand. I really do. Caleb turned his back to him, trying to wrestle down the fire building inside. But it was no use. He slammed his hand against the wooden beam beside him. He made me believe I was the only son. He raised me with rules, with honor. A man doesn't run from his past, he'd say. And yet that's exactly what he did. I didn't come here to defend him, Jonah said. But maybe he was trying to protect you. By lying to me? Caleb snapped. No, Jonah said softly. By protecting your image of him. Maybe he knew he'd already lost me. He didn't want to lose you too. Caleb's voice cracked. Well, he lost us both anyway. Jonah stood finally, walking to the other side of the barn. He leaned against the same beam Caleb had just struck. Jonah slowly opened another letter. It wasn't the first one, nor the last. But it was marked with a red X in the top right corner, probably a note from their father, a message, read this when you're ready. Jonah handed the letter to Caleb. You should be the one to read it. Caleb stared at the paper in his hands, as if it were burning. Then he took a deep breath and began. Caleb, if you're reading this letter, then it's likely that I'm no longer there to explain everything face to face, as a father should. I don't even know where to begin. But if you want the truth, Jonah is my son. And what breaks my heart the most is that I never had the courage to tell you that. Jonah's mother is not to blame. Neither is the other woman. I loved her during the war. A quiet love, interrupted by life. She didn't know I had a family. And when I returned, I chose to remain silent. Caleb paused, swallowing hard. I chose silence because I thought it was the way to protect you, your mother, and Jonah. But I was wrong. You have the right to know. Jonah does too. Both of you are my blood. Both of you deserve a father who dares to speak the truth. But I didn't have the courage. Please forgive me if you can. And if Jonah comes looking for you, don't turn him away. He's not seeking anything. He just wants to know if he was ever loved. Caleb closed the letter without saying a word. His chest rose and fell, but his eyes were no longer tense like before. A coincidence or fate? Outside, the sun began to break through the layers of gray clouds. A ray of light filtered through the stable window, casting its glow over Shadowdust, who was sleeping soundly. Its old head shifted slightly, as if it too sensed that something had changed in the air. Jonah looked at Caleb. I don't want anything. No money. No land. No title. I just want to know if the man I called father ever mentioned me. He did more than that, Caleb said softly. He wrote about you as if he'd always been watching you from afar. Did he ever say he loved me? Jonah asked, his voice almost a whisper. Caleb opened another letter, searched for the right line, then read. I used to think I'd die without ever having the courage to say, I love Jonah. Just like I love Caleb. And I'm sorry to both of you for not being the father you deserved. Jonah nodded, pressing his lips together to keep the tears from falling. Caleb stood up abruptly, walking toward the old gear rack. His boots thudded on the wood beneath him, each step a sharp contrast to the quiet tension in the room. He grabbed a pair of worn leather gloves, shaking off the dust before tossing one to Jonah. You still want to help? Caleb asked, his voice low, but not without a sense of challenge. It was not a question, more of a test. Jonah caught the glove easily. He didn't hesitate. Always. Caleb stood still for a moment, looking at the younger man with an intensity that wasn't entirely hostile, but wasn't friendly either. It was a look of someone assessing another in the middle of a storm, trying to decide whether the other person was an ally or a threat. After a beat, Caleb extended his hand. Not for forgiveness. Not for any grand gesture. Just a handshake. Jonah didn't flinch. He stood up and met Caleb's gaze. Their eyes locked. For the first time since they met, there was a shared understanding, an unspoken agreement between them. With a steady hand, Jonah reached out and grasped Caleb's. The handshake wasn't just a handshake, it was a pact. A promise. A quiet admission that both men, regardless of their past, were going to move forward. Together. They weren't going to pretend things were fine. They weren't going to forget. But they were going to stand side by side. They didn't speak much after that. There was work to be done. Caleb and Jonah moved with practiced ease, as if they had always worked side by side. They tended to Shadowdust, checking his vital signs, adjusting his blankets, massaging his legs, and making sure he was comfortable after the intense strain. Jonah worked without complaint, his hands steady as he helped Caleb with every task. He seemed in his element, no longer a stranger, but someone who understood the rhythm of hard work, the quietude of the land, and the simple fact that sometimes, the hardest part of any struggle is showing up and doing the work. Caleb was no different. He wasn't one to talk much, and now wasn't any different. But there was something in the way he moved, and the way he communicated with Shadowdust and Jonah, that showed this wasn't just a routine, this was personal. He wasn't just saving the horse, he was saving himself. After hours of work, they managed to get Shadowdust settled. The old horse was still weak, but the strain in his body had lessened. It was as if the act of working together had healed something more than just physical wounds, it had healed the space between them. The night stretched on, and the steady rhythm of their actions became a language all its own. No longer were their silences filled with tension. Instead, there was an understanding that grew between them, a bond formed from the raw honesty of their shared history and the quiet respect they began to build. Later that evening, when the work was done, Caleb invited Jonah into the small cabin that had been his home for so long. The smell of roasted meat and the warm glow of the fire added a sense of calm that neither of them had felt in a long time. The table was set simply with bread, meat, and potatoes. Caleb served Jonah a plate, then poured 2 mugs of coffee. The room was filled with the hum of the fire and the occasional crackle of wood, but there was an unspoken comfort in the air. Jonah ate quietly, savoring the food, and Caleb noticed that he ate like a man who hadn't had a proper meal in a long time. There was no shame in it, just a simple acknowledgement of the struggle that had brought them here. "I never asked you," Caleb said, breaking the silence, "how did you find me?" Jonah looked up, setting his fork down. "I didn't. I just knew." Caleb frowned. "You knew?" Jonah nodded. "I knew my dad. He was never one to stay in one place too long. But I knew this was where he would be. The land. The people. It all pointed here." "I don't know what to make of all this," Caleb muttered, pushing his food around on his plate. "One day you're a ghost, and the next, we're sitting here like nothing's changed." "Nothing's changed yet," Jonah replied. "But maybe it's time for something to change." Caleb looked at him. A small, begrudging smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Maybe." The morning sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the farm. Caleb and Jonah woke early, not with a sense of urgency but with the calm determination of men who had faced the hardest parts of the night and survived. Shadowdust was still resting, his breathing steady, though his body still needed time to heal. Caleb had a newfound respect for the old horse, and for the first time, he wasn't just seeing the animal he had grown up with. He was seeing the strength, the loyalty, and the deep bond that had always been there but he had never fully understood. "Ready to give it a try?" Caleb asked Jonah, glancing at the horse. Jonah nodded. "Ready." They led Shadowdust outside, slowly, allowing him to stretch his legs. Caleb mounted first, then helped Jonah onto the saddle. Together, they rode out into the field, side by side, 2 men who had just begun to truly understand each other, just beginning to build a life out of the ashes of what had been broken. It was well past midnight when the first faint sound broke the stillness of the barn. At first, it was so quiet, so soft, that Caleb thought it was just the wind. But then, it came again, more distinct this time. A low whinny. It was Shadowdust. Caleb shot up from his chair, heart racing, and Jonah was right behind him. They didn't exchange a word. There was no need. They both knew what it meant. The horse was struggling again. Shadowdust was down in the stall, shivering. His body was trembling violently, and his eyes were wide with panic. The old animal was weak, too weak to fight off the cold that had gripped him once again. Jonah knelt beside him, checking his pulse, his breathing. "It's shock," he said, his voice grim. "This could be it, Caleb. If we don't act fast." Caleb swallowed hard. He had already lost so much. He couldn't lose Shadowdust, too. No. Not like this. "Not after everything," he said, his voice tight with emotion. He bent down to Shadowdust's side, feeling the tremors that shook the horse's body. The old animal seemed to recognize him, lifting its head slightly and giving a weak, almost pleading look. "Stay with me, old friend," Caleb whispered, his voice breaking. Jonah was already preparing the medical supplies. He moved quickly, knowing time was of the essence. I need you to keep him steady, he said. I'll prepare the fore and the warm packs. We have to keep his temperature up. Together, they worked, their hands moving swiftly in the dim light. Caleb wiped the sweat from Shadowdust's brow, his hands shaking with the weight of the moment. Jonah worked alongside him, his presence steady and calming. They didn't speak much, just focused on the task at hand. For what seemed like hours, they fought to save the horse. Every minute felt like an eternity. Caleb kept glancing at Shadowdust, watching the horse's chest rise and fall with shallow breaths, each one a small victory. As the night wore on, the barn grew colder. But there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. It was the shared commitment between them, the two men who, just days ago, were strangers, and the horse they both loved. Eventually, Shadowdust's breathing began to even out. His trembling lessened. Caleb felt a flicker of hope stir in his chest. He's fighting, Jonah said, glancing at Caleb. He's not ready to give up yet. Caleb didn't answer. He just kept his hand on the horse, feeling the steady rise and fall of its ribs. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The weight of the past, the anger, the confusion, it all seemed to dissolve, replaced by something simpler. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was acceptance. By dawn, Shadowdust was resting quietly. His breathing had returned to normal, and although he was weak, he was alive. Caleb stepped back, wiping his brow. His hands were still shaking, but the adrenaline had worn off, leaving him with a deep sense of exhaustion. Jonah sat down beside him, looking at the horse with a quiet respect. He made it through, Jonah said softly. Yeah, Caleb said, his voice hoarse. We both did. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The barn was peaceful, save for the occasional snort from Shadowdust as he shifted in his blankets. Then Caleb turned to Jonah. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive him. But I know one thing. We did this together. Jonah nodded. Yeah. And that's a start. Later that morning, as the sun began to rise, Caleb and Jonah stood together by the fence, looking out over the field. The sky was clear now, the storm had passed, and the world seemed quieter than it had been in years. For the first time in a long while, Caleb felt something other than loss. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't facing it alone. Jonah looked over at him, his expression calm but steady. So, what now? He asked. Caleb smiled, a small, weary smile. Now, we give it a try. Together. He turned back to the barn, to Shadowdust, to the life he had rebuilt from the ashes of his past. Together, they would rebuild everything. The morning sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the land as the new day began. The storm had passed, leaving the earth wet and fresh, a feeling of renewal in the air. Caleb stood at the fence, his eyes scanning the wide-open space in front of him. Jonah was at his side, both of them silent for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Caleb's hand rested on the top of the fence, his fingers tracing the weathered wood. The barn was quiet now, no more frantic energy, no more panic. Shadowdust was out in the field, grazing slowly, his movements tentative but strong. For the first time since Jonah arrived, Caleb didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in years, there was a sense of possibility in the air. Jonah, standing beside him, spoke first. So, what's next? Caleb glanced at him. The question was simple, but the weight of it felt like a mountain. We keep going, he said. We've got work to do. For Shadowdust. For this place. And maybe for us too. Jonah nodded. Yeah, I'm in. What do we need to do? They worked side by side that day, just as they had the night before, but now there was no tension between them. There was no unspoken question hanging in the air. The trust, though fragile, had been earned in the silence and the shared labor. Caleb showed Jonah how to repair the fence. They cleaned the stalls together, and Caleb taught Jonah how to tend to Shadowdust's old bones. He explained how to properly care for the animal, how to check his vitals, how to make sure he was well fed and rested. Jonah, with his steady hands and quick learning, took to it naturally. They moved together, complementing each other's strengths, slowly building not just a routine, but a rhythm, an unspoken bond between them. At the end of the day, as the sun dipped below the mountains, they stood in the yard, looking at the work they had done. The barn was still standing strong, the fields were being tended to, and Shadowdust was grazing peacefully in the distance. "You've got away with this place," Jonah said. "You always have." Caleb shrugged, but there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. "I've had to. It's just me here. But now." He looked at Jonah, his brother, standing beside him, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. That night, after dinner, Caleb and Jonah sat by the fire. The glow of the flames flickered on their faces, casting shadows in the quiet room. The only sounds were the crackling wood and the occasional sigh of the wind outside. For a while, neither spoke. Then Jonah broke the silence. "You know," he began, "I don't think I ever really understood what it meant to be a family. Not until I met you." Caleb looked at him, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I grew up with nothing. Just my mom. She never talked about my dad. Not really. So I spent years wondering if he'd ever come back, or if he even cared. And then when I found out about you, I thought I'd have all the answers. But instead, it just raised more questions." Caleb nodded, understanding. "I know the feeling. My whole life, I thought I knew who my father was. But the truth about him, about me, about everything, changed everything." Jonah turned toward the fire, his eyes distant. "I don't know if I can ever forgive him. I don't even know if I want to." Caleb didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch. When he spoke, his voice was calm but resolute. "Forgiveness isn't something you do for the other person, Jonah. It's for yourself. It's so you can stop carrying the weight of their mistakes. And that's the part I've never been good at." Jonah didn't respond, but the weight of the conversation hung between them, heavy with the understanding that healing wasn't just about fixing the past, it was about finding peace with it. The following day, with the fields prepared and Shadowdust stable, Caleb decided it was time for them to take their first ride together. He saddled Shadowdust with Jonah's help. The horse was still cautious, his body sore, but there was strength in his step. Caleb mounted first, steadying himself with the ease that came from years of practice. Jonah hesitated for a moment, but then he climbed onto the second saddle, his hands steady despite his nerves. "You sure you're ready for this?" Caleb asked, a teasing glint in his eye. Jonah grinned. "More than ready." They rode out into the field together, the vast open space before them. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the land. It felt like they were on the edge of something new, something they couldn't fully define yet. Shadowdust moved slowly at first, as though unsure of his strength. But as they rode together, the horse seemed to grow more confident, just as Jonah did. They moved in sync, a strange, beautiful rhythm. It wasn't perfect. There were stumbles, moments when Caleb had to steady Jonah's posture, or when Shadowdust's gait faltered. But in those moments, they didn't need words. Their presence, their shared trust, was enough. As the ride continued, Caleb and Jonah began to feel something they had never expected, a sense of connection. Not just as brothers, but as two men who had found something real in each other. Their journey, with all its trials and revelations, had brought them here. Back at the barn, they untacked Shadowdust and led him to his stall. Both men were exhausted, their bodies sore, but there was something else too, a quiet satisfaction. They had shared something profound that day, and it wasn't just the ride, it was the start of something new. Jonah looked at Caleb, the setting sun casting long shadows across his face. "I think we're doing all right, don't you?" Jonah asked. Caleb looked at him, a soft smile breaking through the hard lines of his face. "Yeah, I think we are." Together, they turned toward the barn, ready to face whatever came next, knowing they wouldn't have to face it alone. The early morning sun stretched across the Wyoming plains, casting long shadows on the still wet earth. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. Caleb stood in front of the barn, gazing out over the fields. Shadowdust grazed quietly, moving slowly but steadily, a sign of his recovery. Jonah joined him, leaning against the fence. His eyes followed Caleb's gaze, but there was no rush in his movements, no more tension, no more hurry. It was as if the land itself had paused for them, offering a brief respite to reflect. "We've made it this far," Caleb said, his voice low but steady. "I didn't think we'd get here." Jonah looked at him. "I didn't either," he replied softly. "But we did. And now, we figure out what's next." Caleb nodded, his thoughts drifting. "It's not going to be easy. But maybe we don't have to do it alone anymore." Jonah smiled faintly. "Not alone." As the days passed, the bond between Caleb and Jonah grew stronger. They worked together on the farm, taking care of Shadowdust and fixing up the barn. They fixed fences, mended tools, and began to clear out the overgrown fields. It was hard work, the kind that required both hands and a steady heart, but it was the kind of work that brought them closer. At night, they'd sit by the fire, sharing stories, some about their pasts, some about the things they still didn't know. But more often than not, they didn't need words. The silence was comfortable now. Jonah had never felt this kind of peace. Growing up without a father, without answers, had left him feeling like a ghost. But here, with Caleb, he felt anchored. He was no longer searching for the man who had abandoned him. Instead, he was building something new. "Do you think he would have wanted us to be like this?" Jonah asked one evening as they cleaned up after dinner, the firelight flickering in the corner. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked into the flames, the weight of the question settling on his chest. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I don't think he knew what he wanted. But maybe he wanted us to find a way to heal." Jonah nodded, his gaze distant. "Maybe, but I think we're doing all right, don't you?" Caleb looked at him and smiled. "Yeah, I think we are." One crisp morning, after a week of hard work, Caleb decided it was time. He walked into the barn where Shadowdust had been resting, preparing for another day of care. The old horse looked better now, stronger, and more alert. Caleb saddled Shadowdust and turned to Jonah. "It's time for both of us to get back in the saddle." Jonah hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty passing through his eyes. "You sure about this?" Caleb smiled. "We've come this far. We can't just stop now." Jonah walked over, his steps slower than Caleb's, but no less determined. He took the reins from Caleb's hands, adjusting the saddle, making sure everything was in place. Then, with a deep breath, he climbed onto the horse behind Caleb. They rode out together, side by side, into the morning light. Shadowdust moved smoothly beneath them, his body still a little stiff but holding strong. They didn't speak much, but the rhythm of the ride, steady and unhurried, was enough. They didn't need words. They simply needed to be there. For Caleb, it was a moment of release. The weight of his father's absence, the years of trying to fill a hole that couldn't be filled, all seemed to fade away as he rode alongside Jonah. For Jonah, it was a moment of belonging. He had spent years searching for a place to fit in, and now, with Caleb at his side, he realized he had found it. There was no more searching. This was his home. The days grew longer, the work never truly done, but Caleb and Jonah learned to take it in stride. They worked together, ate together, and began to understand each other more with each passing day. One evening, as they sat on the porch, drinking coffee and watching the stars emerge over the horizon, Caleb turned to Jonah. "You know," Caleb began, his voice soft but firm, "I never imagined it would be like this. I never thought I'd find someone like you." Jonah looked at him, surprised by the honesty in Caleb's voice. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're not the brother I thought I wanted. But you're the one I needed." Jonah smiled, a slow smile that spread across his face. "I think I understand." They sat in silence for a moment, the warmth of the evening sun fading, the air growing cooler, but the peace between them remained. Caleb looked out at the land that had been his father's, and now it was his. It had been a long journey, filled with pain and confusion, but now, with Jonah by his side, it felt like the start of something new. The following days were filled with more work, but it wasn't just about the physical tasks anymore. Caleb and Jonah were rebuilding not only the farm but the foundation of their relationship. They were no longer just two strangers connected by blood, they were brothers, bound by the shared work of the land and the healing of their hearts. One day, while they were repairing a fence near the edge of the property, Jonah turned to Caleb. "You know, I think your father would have been proud of you." Caleb stopped what he was doing and looked at Jonah, the words sinking in. "Proud of me?" "Yeah," Jonah said, his voice quiet but certain. "You took something broken, this place, this life, and made it work. I think he would have wanted that for you." Caleb didn't know how to respond. He had spent so many years resenting his father for leaving him with a life of uncertainty. But now, standing here with Jonah, he realized something. The past didn't have to define him. It didn't have to define either of them. Together, they were creating a new legacy. The air was still heavy with the promise of rain when Caleb and Jonah stood on the porch of the cabin, looking out at the fields. The morning mist had not yet burned off, and the silence of the early hours enveloped them. It was one of those rare moments when time seemed to slow, and for a brief second, the weight of the past didn't feel so heavy. Caleb turned to Jonah, who was leaning against the railing, his arms crossed, eyes distant. "I've been thinking," Caleb began, breaking the stillness, "about what's next. About what we do with all of this." Jonah looked at him, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've made it through the worst. But there's still a lot left to do," Caleb said, motioning toward the fields, the barn, the land that had been both a burden and a blessing. "We're not done yet," Caleb continued. "There's rebuilding, but there's also moving forward. Together." Jonah nodded slowly. "I think we're on the right path. We've made something real here. But it's not just about the work, is it?" "No," Caleb agreed. "It's about what we're building, together. A life. A future." Jonah paused for a moment, considering. "Maybe we can make this farm what it was always meant to be. Not just a place for one person, but for both of us. For a family." Caleb smiled faintly. "That sounds good. A real family." Over the next several weeks, Caleb and Jonah worked tirelessly to transform the farm. They didn't just fix fences or mend equipment, they worked on the land itself, nourishing it back to health. They cleared the overgrown fields, repaired the irrigation system, and planted new crops. Shadowdust, now stronger and more vibrant, moved freely across the land as they worked. There were still challenges, of course. The weather was unpredictable, the crops weren't guaranteed, and there were days when their bodies ached from the endless labor. But with each passing day, they grew stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. The bond between them, once fragile and uncertain, had solidified. Jonah, who had once only known life in a transient state, found peace in the rhythm of the farm. Caleb, who had spent so many years carrying the weight of his father's choices, found a new sense of purpose. And together, they began to see the farm not as a reminder of loss, but as a symbol of hope. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with brilliant oranges and pinks, Caleb and Jonah sat by the fire. The crackle of the flames filled the silence between them. Jonah broke the silence first. "Do you ever think about the future? What's ahead?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "I do," he said finally. "But I think the best way to face the future is to focus on what we can control. What we can build." Jonah nodded. "And what we can make together." Caleb looked at him. "Exactly. Together. That's all I need." Jonah smiled. "And Shadowdust," he added, looking out at the horse grazing nearby. "Of course," Caleb said, chuckling softly. "And Shadowdust." Months passed, and the seasons began to change. The crops grew taller, the barn was fully repaired, and the farm began to thrive in a way it hadn't in years. The hard work paid off, and with it came a sense of fulfillment neither Caleb nor Jonah had expected. As they sat on the porch one evening, looking out at the land they had transformed, Caleb felt something deep within him settle. The ache of loss had softened, and in its place, there was peace. He turned to Jonah, who was sitting beside him, his eyes on the horizon. "You know," Caleb began, "this farm, it's more than just dirt and crops. It's more than just what we work with. It's about what we leave behind." Jonah didn't immediately respond, but he understood. He understood what Caleb was saying without needing to explain it further. It was about the legacy they were creating, not just with the land, but with each other. "We're building something," Jonah said softly. "Something that can last. Something that's ours." Caleb nodded. "A new legacy. A family." Over the next year, Caleb and Jonah continued to grow their farm, but more than that, they grew as men, as brothers. They invited neighbors over for harvest celebrations, hosted small gatherings, and began to rebuild their community. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about sharing what they had with others, about creating something that was meant to last, something that wasn't just about survival, but about life itself. One day, as they stood by the edge of the field, watching the crops sway in the wind, Jonah turned to Caleb. "Do you think you would have ever seen this?" Caleb paused, looking at the land before him. "I think you would have been proud of us," he said quietly. Jonah smiled, his heart lighter than it had ever been. "Yeah, me too." And with that, the two of them stood there, side by side, watching the future unfold. It was early morning again. The same light that had bathed the land a year ago now filtered through the windows of the small cabin. Caleb stood in the doorway, gazing out at the horizon. It was the first morning in months that he had truly felt a sense of peace. The fields before him were full of life, crops tall and healthy, the barn sturdy and welcoming, and in the distance, Shadowdust grazed lazily by the fence. Everything around him had changed, but there was something timeless about the land. It was a reminder of the past, of hard work, of loss and recovery. Jonah walked up behind him, standing silently beside Caleb. The two of them looked out over the farm they had rebuilt together. For a moment, there was no need for words. "You ever think about how far we've come?" Jonah asked after a while, his voice thoughtful. Caleb nodded slowly. "I do. A lot, actually." Jonah looked over at him. "Do you ever wonder if this is what Dad wanted?" Caleb sighed and turned his gaze from the horizon to Jonah. "I think he would have wanted us to find peace with what we've been given. Not just the farm, but each other. Do you think you'll ever forgive him?" Jonah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Caleb took a deep breath, the weight of the question heavy in the air. "I don't think forgiveness is something that happens overnight. But I've come to realize it's not about letting go of the past, it's about learning from it." Jonah nodded. "And about moving forward?" Caleb smiled faintly. "Yeah. Moving forward." As the seasons continued to turn, the farm flourished. It was a hard, sometimes lonely life, but it was theirs. Every harvest, every sunset, every moment of quiet was a reminder of how far they had come. The work wasn't easy, but it never had to be. Caleb and Jonah knew that the real work wasn't in the soil, or the fences, or the barn, it was in themselves. It was in learning to trust, to let go of old hurts, and to embrace the present. One evening, after the harvest was brought in and the day was winding down, they sat on the porch, sharing a drink as the sun dipped low. "I never thought I'd be here," Jonah said, his voice quiet but filled with meaning. "Not like this." Caleb looked over at him, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "It's strange, isn't it? How much can change in a year?" "Yeah. But maybe that's the way life works. It takes time. We just have to trust it." Caleb nodded. "I never imagined I'd find peace after all this. But here we are." Jonah grinned. "Yeah. Here we are." One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Caleb and Jonah sat together by the barn, watching as the wind swept across the fields. The farm was quieter now, the sounds of animals and crops the only interruptions to the stillness. They were no longer two strangers bound by blood, they were brothers, partners in life and in the land. And more than that, they had become stewards of something greater than themselves. They had built a legacy that would live on, one not just of soil and sweat, but of healing, understanding, and love. "You know," Caleb said after a long silence, "I used to think that my father's legacy was a burden. That I was carrying his mistakes. But now, I see it differently." Jonah turned to him, his expression curious. "How do you see it now?" "I see it as a chance," Caleb said, his voice filled with conviction. "A chance to create something new. To do better. Not for him, but for us. For the future." Jonah smiled softly. "You're right. It's not about erasing the past. It's about making sure the future is different. Better." And in that moment, Caleb understood. The land, the farm, Shadowdust, they were all part of something bigger than just the work. They were part of the legacy they were creating together. Underscore 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 underscore. A year had passed since Jonah first arrived at the farm, and in that time, everything had changed. The past, with all its pain and secrets, no longer had the power to hold them back. Caleb had learned to let go of the anger he'd held for so long. Jonah had found a place where he could finally belong. And now, standing side by side, they were looking at a new chapter. "Are you ready?" Jonah asked, looking at Caleb with a sense of calm determination. Caleb smiled, his eyes soft. "I've never been more ready." Together, they stepped forward, ready to continue the work they had started. They didn't know exactly where the future would take them, but they knew they had each other. They had the land. And they had the chance to build a future that was theirs. As the years passed, Caleb and Jonah continued to work the farm. It became a symbol not just of hard work and perseverance, but of healing, forgiveness, and the power of starting over. They built something that was truly their own, something that would live on long after they were gone. The land, like the men who worked it, had healed. And as Shadowdust grew old, his once steady steps slower with age, Caleb and Jonah stood side by side, knowing that the legacy they had built was more than just the land. It was the family they had forged from the ashes of the past. In the quiet moments, as they stood together watching the sun set over the fields, Caleb would often think of the man who had raised him, the man who had left him with so many unanswered questions. And though he never fully understood his father's choices, he had found peace. He had found something that went beyond understanding. It was the simple truth that family, no matter how it starts, can always be rebuilt. And that was enough. The story of Caleb and Jonah is a story of healing. It's not just about healing from the wounds of the past, but also of healing within family relationships, a journey of rediscovering oneself and learning to love those around us, despite the scars left by past mistakes. We cannot change the past, but we can choose how to face it. And from there, we can build a better future, not just for ourselves but for those we love. The story ends with a lesson on forgiveness, starting over, and building family from brokenness. Everything can be rebuilt if we have enough patience and determination.